Our next panel will be discussing the need, purpose, and finding of an environmental impact statement on U.S. immigration policy. And as many of us know in this room, despite the fact that immigration and by extension population continues to be one of the most hotly contested and debated issues, very little attention is given to the ecological consequences of U.S. immigration policy. Just to read you a bit of information from the Pew Hispanic Center, many of you probably already know this, but 82% of United States projected population growth in the coming decades will result from post-2010 immigration. These numbers, of course, will have significant impact. So we'll be discussing this today. One of the things that Progressives for Immigration Reform is doing is instituting an environmental impact statement on U.S. immigration policy. We feel like this could be a powerful tool in helping researchers and policymakers organize their thinking and their policies around U.S. immigration policy. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel. Our first speaker will be Tom Horton. Tom grew up on the Chesapeake Bay during the 1950s and 1960s and has been writing and reporting on it since the 1970s for the Baltimore Sun, National Geographic Magazine, and many others, and in 8 books he has authored. He is a native of Maryland and a graduate of Johns Hopkins University. Currently, he writes for the monthly Chesapeake Bay Journal and is a professor of environmental studies at Salisbury University on Maryland's Eastern Shore.
Just to give you a little background, if you flush the toilet today or plan to, you will be contributing in a minor way to the nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, that are the principal causes of the decline we've seen in the Chesapeake Bay, the nation's largest and most productive estuary. This decline began during the 60s and 70s and resulted in a big and multi-million-dollar EPA study as to the causes of it that lasted from 78 to 82. Didn't look at root causes like population, of course, but found that it was overwhelmingly nutrients, which come from darn near everything people do, nitrogen, phosphorus, from burning fossil fuels, from growing our food, from driving our cars, from heating and cooling our homes, from discharging our wastes to streams and rivers. In 1983, the 6 states of the watershed, and I should back up a little, Chesapeake Bay is a pretty big body of water. It runs about 185 miles from above Baltimore to down around Norfolk, Virginia, where it empties into the Atlantic Ocean. It's relatively tiny compared to its drainage basin, which covers 6 states, 64,000 square miles, about a sixth of the East Coast, starts as far north as Cooperstown, New York, known better perhaps as the Baseball Hall of Fame, but almost up to the Vermont latitude, runs out into West Virginia, way out into Pennsylvania, not that far from Lake Erie, and on down almost to the North Carolina border. So more than most bodies of water, Chesapeake Bay, which really doesn't have much water in it. It looks big, but it's shallow. It's about 1 million feet from Baltimore to Norfolk. It's about 100,000 feet wide. At its widest, it's about 21 feet deep. So doesn't have a lot of water in it to dilute what's running off a fifth or a sixth of the East Coast. So more than most places, what happens on the land, what humans do on the land, and how many humans are doing it is pretty critical to restoration of the bay. Our original Save the Bay, Restore the Bay deadlines of 2000 and 2010 have been kind of blown, and they are now 2025 with a kind of a check-in point at 2017. While we have proceeded, as in most places with environmental stuff, to look almost exclusively at reducing our footprints, not wanting to count how many feet move in, we have made progress in one aspect. In this latest round, after we blew the 2010 deadlines, EPA, which with the 6 states of the watershed, Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania principally, also a little bit Delaware, New York, and West Virginia, they did say that we have to cap pollutants so that even as population continues to rise, and all of them are absolutely dedicated to a rising population as far as I can see, even as that continues, we will have to find offsets. So what I thought I would talk about today is how do you do that? How do you act as if population does not matter and offset it so that pollution never grows? And can you do that? And what does it look like when you try to do that? Sometimes to put it in perspective, I tell people from the beginning of time for Europeans, the Jamestown colony in 1608, to when I was a kid in the 50s, growing up around the Bay, population reached 8 million in the watershed. And the Bay was pretty healthy, had local problems, but all its big systems were functioning, a lot of fish, a lot of ducks, all that stuff. By the 1980s, population had doubled to 16 million. It's about 17 now. And the Bay had crashed, and the reasons were not just population related. Some of it was just taking out fish faster than they could reproduce. Doesn't matter how many people are not there if you do that. And now we are looking at tripling it by about 2045, 2050, growing about 1.5 million a decade. And as we triple population, we are also saying that we're going to take water quality back to about what it resembled when there were 8 million living here. Good trick if you can do it. And so what we're saying is, yep, population's going to grow, but we're not going to let pollution grow. So what do? One big source of pollution, the nitrogen and phosphorus getting in the Bay, is sewage treatment, the wastes from 17 million people. We know sewage treatment pretty well, and we can probably continue to grow at least for another 5 to 10 years in most places and actually make the water in the Bay cleaner, at least from sewage treatment. An example is Blue Plains, which serves all the toilets here and in Northern Virginia and a lot of suburban D.C., Maryland. Blue Plains has embarked on the third big round of upgrades since the 1970s. These have been billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar expenditures. The one now is simply mind-boggling, including boring gigantic caverns under D.C. and under the Potomac that will actually collect excess sewage until it can be treated to a higher degree later. It's going to cost way more than $1 billion. What's interesting, though, is the cost per pound of pollutant removed this time is going to be just about 100 times more per pound than it was in the last upgrade in the 90s. It leads me and most other people to think that this is about it. We have hit the area of diminishing returns. I don't believe there will ever be, barring some technology as now not foreseen by anyone, any way to do better. And what you find is between now and 2017, we're going to grow population in the Bay, and sewage is going to get cleaner. Then what you see is after 2017, it's going to start creeping back up, and in some places, a lot of places actually, by 2025, our final cleanup deadline, we're going to be pretty close to where we are now after spending billions and billions of dollars. So, I would suggest that this is going to look like a pretty good success if you're running for office or in office for the next 4, 5, 6 years, maybe 10, 12 in some cases, but may reach its limits. Now, actually the fastest growing source of water pollution to the Chesapeake is not coming out of a pipe. It's from the runoff from stormwater. As we have doubled population, we have more than doubled paved surfaces. You name it, roofs, streets, shopping centers, everything that turns soft earth into hard earth causes a lot more water, carrying a lot of toxins, for everything from automobile exhaust to the fallout airborne from power plants to dog and cat poop, which is actually gets to be kind of significant around the heavily paved areas like D.C. Stormwater is tougher than sewage treatment. We have built thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of detention ponds and settling ditches and all sorts of BMPs, they call them best management practices, to catch stormwater throughout this 64,000 square mile watershed. They haven't worked too good. We are now embarked on a new process that does the same thing, but in a way that mimics nature more. It stays away from steep slopes and fragile soils. It starts with the design of every new development, trying to make the water soak in much as it did before you developed. And you can do some pretty amazing things here. The problem is, we now, with these tens of thousands of existing stormwater detention practices, are probably have a tenth of the money and personnel needed across the watershed to inspect them, to make sure they're continuing to work. One of the counties near here, Anne Arundel County, the capital of Maryland, Annapolis, has 11,000 of these BMPs, which are supposed to be inspected annually. They have one inspector, and he can get to each one every 11 or 12 years if he has a good year. And the level we're going to offset the impacts of population will require probably an order of magnitude more inspectors and inspections. The bottom line is, there's no way that we have now of even coming close to, we're going to do all these things, but we're not going to know whether they're done right. We're not going to know whether they're working. We're not going to exactly have funding sources to maintain them. It's good on paper. I don't see any way now that it's liable to work. It will cost many more billions. And, you know, we never look at these costs as costs of growth. Growth is good, growth is necessary, growth is inevitable. That's kind of the mantra. And these costs are, you know, they're talked about a lot, but they're not talked about as costs of growth. Probably the biggest hope for offsetting all the pollution from future population, though, lies with agriculture. Agricultural runoff, which is not directly related to population, but of course it is, because the more people you got to feed, the more intensive and widespread your agriculture has to be. Agriculture is the biggest pollutant of the bay, partly because we got 12 million acres of cropland draining into Chesapeake Bay. The theory is this: it's kind of like the cap and trade that had some success in reducing air pollutants in recent decades, where, let's say you got an old power plant that is at a point that it would cost them $1 billion to take another few pounds of pollution out of the air. You got somebody building a new plant nearby, and they got modern technology. For a tenth of $1 billion, they could remove 100 times as much pollution. So you trade the old plant, rather than spend all that money for very little gain, shovels some money on the new plant, and they really do a great job. The theory is we're going to do that with farms, as these big sewage treatment plants, which have a big ratepayer base and a lot of money at their disposal, as they hit the wall on removing pollution, they won't need to do that. They'll just shovel some money at farmers across 12 million acres, and much cheaper per pound, they'll take out the same pollutants that the sewage treatment can't really take out anymore. Really, a lot of our success in keeping ahead of population growth without having to talk about it lies in this. It's called nutrient trading. And I would guess, again, on paper it could work, but I have never seen a mature restoration program of the magnitude of what we are undertaking on the Chesapeake hang its hat on something that is pretty much totally untried, untested anywhere in the world on this scale. How do you trade something coming out of a pipe in Washington for diffuse sources across 12 million acres in 6 states from New York to North Carolina? No one really knows. It is astounding to me. I've just been in meetings on this that everyone says it's the way we've got to go. We have no idea whether it's going to work, how it's going to work, how it's going to be monitored, how it's going to be enforced. So this is how we're doing it. This is how we are ignoring population while saying that we are going to restore the Chesapeake anyhow, no matter how many people move in. I guess my point is that, I would have said maybe 10 or 15 years ago that at some point we've just got to face the facts. We've got to talk about population. But I am astounded by the partly human cleverness, partly hubris, partly just an unwillingness to face root causes, So I guess my bottom feeling is parts of all this I just went over are going to work. Some are going to work for a while. Some are not going to work at all, but we're not even going to know for 10 or 15 years how well or how badly they worked. I probably shouldn't have read a book a couple of years ago called The Collapse of Complex Societies by a guy named Joe Tainter, because Tainter looked for a common thread in the collapse of societies from Byzantium to Rome to the Mayans, and the closest he could come was that they collapsed of their own complexity. They just got to a point where the money and resources and organization required to keep ever greater levels of complexity just overwhelmed them. And I'm not suggesting that in Chesapeake Bay we were about to see even the total collapse of Chesapeake Bay, let alone the complex of society, the collapse of society, but it does remind me of that. I feel that we are building kind of a paper solution that will require a level of organization and management and resources that has never been undertaken successfully by humans anywhere before, and saying it's going to work. Perhaps at some point between now and 2025 we'll actually have a conversation about population, but it is progress that we have acknowledged that we have to offset population. That was not in the ball game. That's a good first step. That was not on the radar screen. EPA acknowledges it. All the states acknowledge it. So it's a starting point. The other problem with this, of course, is we are couching all of these impacts very narrowly, nitrogen and phosphorus. There is a lot more to quality of life, to the environment, to nature, to protecting what we love and hold dear about this region than N and P, as we often say. And, I think that's... I should also just close, Chesapeake Bay has many, many problems, has been vastly degraded, far, far from dead. I sometimes go to California and people console me. I hear Chesapeake Bay died. No, it did not. I take students on kayak trips within 40 miles of the District of Columbia where we are able to catch enough fish, find enough raw oysters, which are healthy, and catch enough blue crabs to feed 20 kids and me for a week. That's not a dead body of water. There's a lot left to worry about here. It's not over and done. So That's my take on things.